The Ukraine war with Russia should have never happened. If I were president, it never would have happened. We're trying to get it ended. One way or the other, we have to get it ended. So.
Мама! Охренеть!
Ебать.
О, господи, это что было? Это не дрон, надеюсь?
Нет.
It's hard to ignore how quickly global narratives shift when political promises meet real-world conflict. When Donald Trump repeats the line that the Russia-Ukraine war would never have started if he were president, the claim lands in the middle of a world already exhausted by years of destruction, displacement, and impossible negotiations. His words echo louder when placed beside yesterday's social media posts, where he doubled down on that message again, insisting that leadership alone could have prevented the bloodshed that unfolded since February 2022. And for many people who scroll through their feeds, it creates a familiar tension between memory and reality, between what was said in the past and what the world is actually facing now. Yesterday's Kyiv footage once again showed the scale of the struggle. An overnight barrage hitting housing blocks, emergency crews working under dim lights, and thousands of families trying to rebuild from pieces. This is the context in which those political claims land. On one side, statements coming from the U.S. political stage. On the other, the visible consequences of decisions, diplomacy, and force that have shaped the region for almost 4 years. And against that backdrop, Trump's latest tweet becomes not just a political message, but part of a larger debate about responsibility, prediction, and the distance between campaign statements and the complexities of international conflict. At the same time, Volodymyr Zelensky's interview from yesterday offered a different lens. In calm, restrained language, he outlined the kind of pressure Ukraine is under today. Pressure from the battlefield, pressure inside his own government, and pressure from international partners shaping peace terms that millions of Ukrainians must live with. He did not mention Trump directly, but when asked about the ongoing claim that this war would have never happened under a different U.S. president, Zelensky returned to something he has said many times before, that the decisions that led to this war came from Moscow, not Washington. His response didn't carry the drama of political rallies or online declarations. It was simply a reminder that Ukraine is fighting a war that has shattered its cities and drained its people, regardless of the global commentary surrounding it. And then there is Vladimir Putin.
Но предметно, с нами этот текст не обсуждается. И могу предположить, почему. Причина, полагаю, та же самая. Администрации США не удается до сих пор заручиться согласием украинской стороны. Украина против. Если в Киеве не хотят обсуждать предложение президента Трампа и отказываются от этого, то и они, и европейские поджигатели войны должны понимать, что события, которые произошли в Купянске, будут неизбежно повторяться.
His statement, shared again on Russian state media and reposted widely across X, fully aligned with Trump's claim, saying almost word for word that the conflict would not have begun if Trump were in office in 2022. For Putin, this narrative serves a clear purpose. It shifts attention away from the decision he ultimately made and reframes the war through the lens of U.S. politics. It's a simple message, easily spread, and perfectly timed to influence conversations outside Russia's borders. For many analysts, this alignment between a former U.S. president's rhetoric and the current Russian president's messaging is not a coincidence, but a sign of how strategic narratives are crafted to shape public perception far beyond the battlefield. This combination of voices, Trump's online posts, Zelensky's cautious interview, and Putin's carefully crafted statements, reveals how differently each side presents the same war. And as these messages collide, the public is left trying to understand whether political promises reflect real geopolitical influence or whether they are simply part of a familiar pattern where leaders claim certainty over events they cannot truly control. Today, that question is more relevant than ever, because the contrast between political rhetoric and the actual state of the war has never been clearer. When you look closely at the timeline of events leading up to the war, the picture becomes even more complicated than the political slogans suggest. In the final years of Trump's presidency, relations between the United States and Russia were marked by sharp contradictions. There were moments of unusually open praise between Trump and Putin, moments of sharp criticism, and a series of policy decisions that analysts still debate today. But while Trump frequently insists he could have prevented the invasion, the reality is that intelligence reports, troop movements, and Russian planning were already accelerating long before the change of administration. Some U.S. officials argue that Moscow's military buildup began under the assumption that Ukraine's Western support would remain limited, regardless of who occupied the White House. It's also important to look at how Ukraine reacted during that period. Even before the invasion, the Ukrainian government was preparing for the possibility of Russian escalation. Its armed forces were undergoing reforms, training with Western partners, and strengthening defensive positions in the East. These were not the actions of a nation confident that peace was guaranteed by international leadership. Instead, they reflected an understanding that Ukraine's security had always been tied to unpredictable geopolitical forces, not a single foreign leader's promises. When Zelensky was asked again yesterday whether the war hinged on American politics, he stayed consistent. The decision to invade came from Russia, and any explanation that puts the responsibility elsewhere risks oversimplifying a conflict that has roots stretching back decades. Putin's latest statement reinforces this complexity. His insistence that the war would not have happened under Trump seems designed to shift attention away from the choices made by the Kremlin in early 2022. It reframes the narrative in a way that benefits him politically, placing blame on the West instead of acknowledging Russia's long-standing interest in exerting control over Ukraine. When this message is repeated across Russian media and shared widely on social platforms, it creates an impression that the conflict was somehow provoked by the United States, a framing that works well for domestic audiences and supports Moscow's broader political strategy abroad. At the same time, new developments around the current peace discussions show how far the situation has moved from those early political claims. Recent leaks, diplomatic briefings, and public statements from Washington indicate that the United States is deeply involved in shaping the terms of a potential settlement. These terms have been controversial because they raise difficult questions about territory, sovereignty, and long-term security guarantees. European allies and Ukrainian officials have expressed concerns that the negotiations may be moving too quickly or offering concessions that could create new risks in the future. This tension highlights a truth often hidden behind strong political statements. Ending a war is rarely as simple as declaring that it should never have started. The reality on the ground continues to shape these conversations more than any speech or social media post. The attacks on Kyiv, the strains on Ukraine's infrastructure, the exhaustion of its population, and the ongoing displacement of families have forced leaders to make decisions that extend far beyond campaign rhetoric. Every new strike exposes the weight of those decisions, reminding the world that behind every political message is a conflict that cannot be undone by revisiting the past. And when Trump, Putin, Zelensky, and other global figures speak about what could have been, what should have happened, or who is to blame, the truth remains that the war has already reshaped millions of lives in ways that no single promise could have prevented. The conversation surrounding Trump's past statements becomes even more complex when you revisit the footage from the years before the invasion. In several interviews and rallies, he confidently declared that Putin would have never dared to launch a full-scale offensive if he were still in office. Clips of these moments circulate regularly, especially now, resurfacing whenever global events intensify or new attacks hit Ukrainian cities. Yet, when you compare those proclamations with the dynamics between Washington and Moscow at the time, the certainty becomes harder to anchor in anything measurable. International deterrence isn't something that hinges on personality alone. It involves alliances, intelligence coordination, military posture, and a long chain of strategic calculations that no leader fully controls. This is why many experts caution against narratives that simplify war down to a single individual's presence or absence. Meanwhile, Zelensky's recent interview added an unexpected layer to this broader discussion. When he was asked how he views the claims that a different U.S. administration could have prevented the war altogether, he didn't offer sweeping political statements or direct confrontation. Instead, he spoke about the responsibilities his government is now carrying: stabilizing regions under threat, negotiating from a position weakened by years of bombardment, and navigating pressure from allies with competing interests. His tone was steady, deliberate, and grounded in the current reality rather than debates about alternate timelines. For a leader managing a war on his own soil, conjecture about what might have been is overshadowed by what his country is living through today. This contrast between political showmanship and the quiet realism of a wartime president reveals how differently global figures approach the same question. Putin's commentary, delivered through state media and echoed on social platforms, stands at the opposite end of that spectrum. His video clip from yesterday was direct, almost rehearsed, repeating the idea that the conflict was avoidable and framing the West as the destabilizing force behind everything that unfolded. For Russia, this message is strategic. It shifts responsibility outward, reinforces domestic narratives, and attempts to position Moscow as reacting rather than initiating. When paired with Trump's statements, it creates a sense of agreement between two powerful figures on opposite sides of the conflict, even though both are using the claim for entirely different purposes. One uses it to critique a political opponent, the other uses it to justify a war. And yet, when both messages circulate online simultaneously, they reinforce each other in ways that shape public perception far beyond their intended audiences. What often gets lost in those competing narratives is the experience of the people caught in the middle. The families who fled when the first sirens sounded. The workers who lost their homes when residential towers were hit. The elderly living in districts that lost power during the most recent drone attacks. These are the realities that never fit into political claims about alternative scenarios or promises of peace rooted in hindsight. They reflect a war that has dragged on through winter after winter, outlasting headlines and political cycles, leaving behind a trail of exhaustion that cannot be undone by speculation about past decisions. This is why the debate about whether Trump's promise was a prediction, a political strategy, or a simplified retelling of complex events continues to fuel argument on every platform. It isn't just about verifying a claim, it's about the way leaders shape memory, influence public sentiment, and project confidence even when dealing with forces no administration has ever fully controlled. The clash between those messages and the reality on the ground exposes how wide the gap can be between political storytelling and the difficult truth of war. And as the world watches the latest developments unfold, that gap continues to grow clearer with each passing day. As the discussion deepens, the contrast between political narratives and unfolding events becomes even more visible. The past 24 hours alone highlight how quickly reality can overshadow the simplicity of claims made from podiums or through social media posts. Kyiv's emergency crews worked through the night again, responding to fires sparked by another wave of drones, clearing debris from apartment blocks, and restoring power to neighborhoods plunged into cold and darkness. These images, captured by local journalists and shared across global networks, document a war defined less by statements from distant leaders and more by the daily resilience of ordinary people navigating the consequences of decisions far beyond their control. In this environment, Trump's renewed message, repeated in his latest tweet, arrives as part of a larger political rhythm that intensifies as elections draw near. It revisits a theme he has long used to separate himself from his opponents: the idea that conflict and instability are avoidable under his leadership. This framing appeals to those who view foreign policy through the lens of personal strength and negotiation style. But when observers look beyond rhetoric and examine the complex web of intelligence, military commitments, diplomatic negotiations, and shifting alliances that define modern geopolitics, the notion that a single personality could have unilaterally prevented a major European war becomes more difficult to support with evidence. The questions raised by his statement deserve attention, but they cannot be answered through hypotheticals alone. At the same moment, Zelensky's approach remains rooted in immediate realities. His emphasis is not on revisiting the past, but on the demands of the present, coordinating support with allies, negotiating peace terms that protect Ukraine's territorial integrity, and responding to domestic political pressures stirred by fatigue and uncertainty. Recent reports of internal disagreements within Ukraine's leadership, the resignation of key officials, and debates over potential concessions all point to a government balancing survival with the need for long-term stability. Zelensky's steady tone during his interview underscores the weight of these responsibilities. He speaks not as someone evaluating past U.S. presidents, but as a leader addressing a war that continues to reshape his country with every new strike. Meanwhile, Putin's strategic communication remains consistent and carefully timed. His latest video, shared widely across X, follows a pattern that Russian messaging has maintained since the early days of the conflict. Portray the war as a response to Western aggression, challenge the legitimacy of Ukraine's sovereignty, and frame Russia's actions as inevitable. By aligning his statement with Trump's claim, whether intentionally or opportunistically, he reinforces a narrative that shifts attention away from Russia's decision to invade and toward questions about American leadership instead. This alignment creates a powerful rhetorical loop, one part political, one part propagandist, that circulates far beyond Russia's borders and influences public opinion in subtle but significant ways. As these narratives interact, the global audience becomes the battleground for competing interpretations of the same events. Political supporters use clips selectively. Influencers attach commentary to moments that reinforce their views. Analysts dissect each statement for hidden signals about future strategies. But for the millions living amid the conflict, the significance of these exchanges is measured differently. Their reality is not shaped by what might have happened under a different administration, but by the immediate need for safety, stability, and an end to the bombardment that has defined their lives for years. Their experiences reveal the limits of political storytelling, no matter how confidently delivered. This is where the core question takes shape. Not whether a promise was sincere or strategically crafted, but how such statements influence public understanding of a conflict that continues to evolve in unpredictable ways. When a leader claims certainty about events as complex and far-reaching as war, the audience must look past the simplicity of the message and consider the broader landscape, one shaped by history, intelligence decisions, economic pressures, military realities, and the actions of multiple governments. The war did not begin because of a single moment, and it will not end because of a single statement. Its roots run deep, and its consequences will extend long after political cycles shift and headlines fade. And as the world watches the newest footage from Kyiv, listens to the latest interviews from Ukrainian officials, reads the newest posts from Trump, and hears the carefully crafted messages from Moscow, it becomes clear that the story of this war cannot be reduced to parallel claims about alternate outcomes. It remains a conflict shaped by choices that were made, pressures that still exist, and a future that depends not on promises about what might have been, but on the difficult, ongoing work of negotiating what comes next.